When white men first settled on the shores of South Africa more than 300 years ago, they had no idea of the wealth the country had in store for them. They conquered the inhabitants in a series of bloody wars and imposed white rule. Racial domination was common to most colonial enterprises, but in South Africa it became uniquely refined and known as apartheid. Apartheid is a word from Afrikaans, the language of Dutch, French, and German colonists who called themselves Afrikaners. Apartheid means apartness. It was the method by which Afrikaners set out to preserve their own identity and to achieve power over all South Africa's people of any color. Apartheid was the creed of these men, the leaders of the National Party, who formed the first all-Afrikaner government when they were elected to power in 1948.
The central issue of the election undoubtedly was the slogan apartheid. People didn't know really what it meant, but it certainly meant that the white people would retain their privileges longer than they were likely to do if there wasn't any apartheid.
It was the culmination, the climax of dreams and thoughts and hopes, secret and perhaps not so secret, of all the Afrikaner people which came to realization in 1948.
For Afrikaners, 1948 was a milestone on the route to the power which they now enjoy. But white privilege, racial superiority, and the exploitation of African labor, the elements of apartheid, were nothing new in South Africa.
In the early stages of construction, the native laborer, always very willing and teachable, played a great part. There were certainly plenty of him. His wages were not excessive, and he didn't belong to any union. But he worked hard from morn till night, and the line gradually assumed shape and form. These native gangs are easy to handle. They respond splendidly to training and soon become expert hands in the arduous work of rail construction. You can see how efficiently they pull together, and how thoroughly and wholeheartedly they help progress.
The fact is, white occupation of our fatherland has brought deprivation, dispossession, enslavement, cruelty as probably never experienced anywhere else in the world, where the white man set himself up as something next to God and blacks as almost nothing.
The British took control of the Cape from the Dutch in 1806. Britain sent men and women to settle the borders between the Cape Colony and troublesome African tribes. The armies of the British Empire were more effective than the Afrikaners at defeating the African peoples. But British rule was resented by the Afrikaner farmers, or Boers as they were called in Dutch, who had settled there many years before. They depended on slaves to work their farms. When the British made slave-owning illegal, 6,000 Boers set off with their families and servants and traveled deep inland to escape British control and to establish their independence. They called themselves voortrekkers, the people who trekked out. Their exodus became known as the Great Trek. Ever since, Afrikaners have complained that they were done down by the British.
The whole history of the Great Trek was one of dissatisfaction with the way in which the Afrikaner has been treated. Then there was the way in which the blacks were allowed to settle among whites, and the problems of a border situation, raids of the blacks in the white areas, thefts, murdering and burning down farms and so on.
Free from the British, the trekkers settled in country which Africans regarded as theirs. One group went to the Zulus to negotiate an agreed sharing of the land. The Zulu king, named Dingaan, decided the best way to keep the land was by force and had the trekkers murdered. Other Boer trekkers decided to take revenge. One evening in December 1838, 470 of them formed their 60 wagons in a circle in a well-defended spot next to a river. Generations later, Afrikaners built a national monument on the site. The trekkers pulled their animals inside this laager and waited. The following morning, 10,000 Zulus attacked. Their spears and shields were no match for the Boers' rifles and cannon. Just 3 trekkers were wounded, but 3,000 Zulus lay dead. The Boers called their victory the Battle of Blood River. Each year, on December the 16th, Afrikaners celebrate the anniversary of that triumph as a holy day.
They called on God to give them the victory on that situation, punishing a person for a precious deed. And God did it. It was a matter of punishment.
The Boer trekkers moved slowly deeper into the country. When they found water and fertile soil, they stopped and took as much land as they and their cattle needed.
That huge area of land became your farm. Invariably, there would be black villages in that area, and they would become your servants. They would find that the land of their forefathers suddenly had been taken over by these Boer trekkers.
My great-grandfather settled over there just down, at the edge of that hill. And that was about 1860, early in the 60s. They settled down there, and the farm Doringfontein, on which we are standing now, is the whole farm on the hills there over till you see the horizon there, and then on this side again on the hills. It is a large farm. And he was the first white owner of this farm. There were not blacks on this area when they entered it.
The evidence that Africans did occupy most of the land hundreds of years earlier is conclusive. This sculpture is one of many early African objects that has been carbon dated. It was made in the 5th century. But South African schoolchildren are still taught that the whites arrived first.
There is no single part of South Africa that can be regarded as exclusively white, nor can we accept the fact that there were large parts of this country that were unoccupied. Our people, in the latter part of the 19th century, were pastoralists, agriculturalists, who moved their herds from place to place, who plowed land and allowed it to lie fallow if it became worked out. And if you find a man at one corner of his huge field, you cannot say that this field is not yours or this area isn't yours because I didn't find you at that particular corner at that particular time. It is also true, of course, that South Africa is a very big country. When the whites arrived here in 1652, there couldn't have been more than 2 million South African blacks. And therefore, they could not have occupied every inch of South Africa. But this country was theirs.
In the 1840s, the Basotho people occupied these large areas of fertile ground. By the late 1860s, after a series of wars, the Boers and British had squeezed them into a narrow strip of land against a dense range of mountains. The effect was disastrous. Like many other areas into which Africans were driven, the little land they were left had to be massively overcultivated, and the result is now erosion. Rain has washed away the fertile topsoil. A pattern of life was being set. Africans' land, the means of their livelihood, was seized. What was left was insufficient for subsistence, and in order to survive, Africans were forced to work for white men, initially on farms. Diamonds were discovered in 1867, and then gold in 1886. The need for black labor became desperate. To keep costs down and to control the labor force, African workers were herded into compounds. They were forbidden to be in town without a pass. Offenders were harshly punished. The machinery which was to produce apartheid was getting into gear. The diamond and gold fields were the richest in the world. They revolutionized South Africa and brought a clash between white men. British imperialists craved the riches, but the gold was in the hands of the Afrikaners, or Boers, in their independent republic of the Transvaal. Britain went to war to capture the prize. The Anglo-Boer War was an unequal fight. On the one side, the full might of the British Army, almost 500,000 men, and on the other, guerrilla forces of Afrikaner farmers, outnumbered by 10 to 1. It took 3 years and 70,000 dead before the British forced the Boers to surrender. The British succeeded by burning Boer farms and by herding Boer women and children into the world's first concentration camps. Many Afrikaners became Britain's most bitter enemies. They were determined to recover the power to run their own lives in the way they saw fit. The graves of their families are tended still. But most Afrikaners forget the other victims of the war. At least 14,000 Africans died too, in camps and fighting on both sides. What's more, it was Africans who lost the peace. British business needed South Africa to be profitable and peaceful. To reconcile the defeated Afrikaners to empire, Britain in 1910 handed control of the country to Afrikaners and English speakers, by now almost equal in numbers. They called the country the Union of South Africa. Both groups of whites were agreed on what to do with the Africans. They needed their labor. The British colonial government had long taxed Africans' huts. Shortly before Union, they had imposed an extra tax on every African in Zululand. It was designed to be beyond their means, to make them leave their villages and go to work for white men, to earn the cash to pay it. When Zulus failed to pay, colonial troops burned their villages and crops. One Zulu chief, Bambata, still refused. He formed the guerrilla army and took his men into the hills in the last armed African revolt. In 1906, colonial troops executed the rebels and cut off Bambata's head. Some African families who lost land by force in the 19th century clubbed together to buy farms at the turn of the 20th. These Africans were competing with the white man in commercial agriculture. They wanted to avoid having to leave their families and work down the mines.
They wanted to come here because it was safe for them to work on their own rather than to work for the whites. They wanted to live peacefully, not under permission of anyone. After my father bought the land, what he grows in the land is mealies, beans, peppercorn. It was enough to save himself, his family, and what remains he can sell to other people. It was much better than working in Johannesburg because he has no place for his children to live in a proper way. So he thought it would be much better for him to buy his own place where he would live with his family.
Such African enterprise threatened the supply of labor both for white farmers and for the mines. To stop the spread of commercial African farming and keep the mines going, the government made it illegal for Africans to buy land outside the areas to which white conquest had confined them. These areas were called native reserves. They stamped the shape of 20th century South Africa. Africans were restricted to just 7% of the land, although they were 70% of the population.
The chief enemy of the African people has been and is still today the Land Act of 1913. It caused starvation because the breadwinners would leave the country to provide the big farmers of South Africa with cheap labor.
More and more Africans had to seek work on white farms. In return for 90 days' work a year, they were permitted to live on the farm, but they were paid nothing.
Singaholi imali. Ukugqoka. Wawugqokswa ngabelungu uma usebenza ekhishini, kodwa uma usekhaya wawugqokswa ngabazali bakho. Bangaholwa lutho. Babahola ukulima, ukufuya izinkomo kuphela. Babangaholi lutho. Akusiba abantu abaphathana kahle. Ngoba bebangasibhadari, abasibhadari. Abathandi ukuthi umuntu abe nento enhle.
When South Africa was given self-government in 1910, Africans could not believe that Britain had washed its hands of them. A group of clergy, teachers and chiefs sent polite delegations to lobby the South African and British governments, but their petitions were turned away. These black intellectuals formed the ANC, the African National Congress. One of them was Josiah Gamede.
They were not hostile to the British government, but they were accepting that they were subjects of the British government, and that as subjects of the British government, they were entitled to the rights which all British subjects were supposed to enjoy. Western civilization is supposed to be based on truth, honesty, fairness, and justice. Just felt that if your cause was just, then civilized people would see to it that justice was carried out.
Many South Africans still looked to Britain. Black Africans hoped in vain for justice. Some Afrikaner leaders wanted the benefits of empire. But extreme Afrikaners resented the British connection. In 1914, a handful of generals attempted a brief revolt. More than 100 rebels died. Another episode in the catalogue of Afrikaner resentment. South Africa's head of state was still the British king, who sent a governor-general to represent him. The economy served the interests of empire, and British style dominated South African public life. White politics was still consumed by the passion of Boer versus Britain. The needs of Africans were a low priority.
the separation between white and black on the political level and on the human level was so complete, and the lack of interest on the part of the white community of the hopes, the feelings, the sufferings, the aspirations of the black community. They were so far removed from one another that under normal circumstances, the vast majority of your whites, and especially the Afrikaner people, would have had no interest in what was happening and what was living in the hearts of your black community.
Conditions for most Africans were harsh. A black miner had to serve a 9-month contract. Each day took him closer to its end, but only if the work quota was certified by a white miner. If not, then the day's work did not count, and the contract would drag on. In extreme cases, frustration led to violence.
My father had to work underground, drilling holes with a chisel and hammer like this until he gets 4 feet in the rock. And if he didn't fulfill that 4 feet with the chisel and hammer, then he was not paid. He was told by the white miner that he's only paid by porridge in the compound. And this frustrated the black miners so much that some committed suicide by holding the white miner after he was about to blast the holes and then lit the fuse. Then he would hold the white miner, so they must all die there.
Leonard Mdingi had heard this story from his father, but still followed him to the mines. Like every miner, he had to live in a compound, a series of bunkhouses close to the mine shaft.
We were very crowded, 20 to 30 people in one room. It was very cold. I was sleeping on concrete bunks or like that. I had only one blanket. That was the only blanket I had to wrap myself. I felt very uneasy to see so many people in one house.
Segregated from white miners, hundreds of miles from their families, every aspect of their lives was controlled by the compound manager.
We were discouraged to meet women because the compound manager felt that we will get VD. People were practicing homosexuality right inside the rooms, and nobody objected to that. I would say that living in a compound, you find that your whole thinking becomes distorted, and you feel that you more or less think like an animal.
Black miners were paid less than 1/10 of a white miner's wage. In 1922, the mine owners, faced with a falling gold price, tried to cut costs by putting Africans to do jobs previously reserved for whites. To protect their jobs, white miners, mainly Afrikaners, went on strike. Inspired by communists, they called for a revolution against the mine owners and their political figurehead, Prime Minister Smuts. The strikers attacked black workers, and some white communists marched under the slogan, "Workers of the world, fight and unite for a white South Africa." Martial law was imposed by Smuts, who routed the strikers with artillery and bomber aircraft. By siding with the mine owners, Smuts made himself the enemy of poor Afrikaners. His government, whose party had been in power since Union in 1910, fell in 1924. His successors passed many laws to protect white workers from black competition. They called it the civilized labor policy.
You know, if you look at all the legislation that had been passed since Union, then you notice that from both sides, provisions were made reflecting the pattern of life in South Africa, separation in a sense. It was simply a case of legalizing what was conventionally accepted. This wasn't really to deprive the blacks of anything. It really was to regulate their presence amongst the whites.
Along the coast from Durban have risen many pretty seaside resorts with dull-like houses, for the prosperous South Africans have made themselves quite comfortable. We have seen what the white man has achieved for himself in South Africa. What has he done for the native? He has put him to work.
One for Nigel, one for Andy, one for Mary, one for Irene, one for Brian, and one for Ernie.
Nambarry. Is your name in the pot?
Check Ford first at Irish Road Motors, Adelaide Street, just behind the City Hall in Belfast. We're open for parts and service from 8 in the morning to 10 at night, Monday to Friday, and from 9 to 3 on Saturdays. And just look at these all-inclusive prices, the most competitive available. Where in Northern Ireland can you get service like this? Check Ford first at Irish Road Motors. Phone Belfast 244 021.
Once a hooly hooly cutie, loved to hula boola hoop. She preferred to hoop a loop than to eat a hula hoop. Hoop a loop a hula hoop. Hoop a loop a hula hoop. A walla balla hula hoop. A walla balla hula hoop. About a hungry bandicoot said don't hula with your hoop. You should eat it with one swoop. Eat, don't hula. Hula 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 hoop. Hula 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 hoop. Oops. Hula 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 hoop. Eat, don't hula.
Some people will always trust their sense of taste. Some people will always buy Krona margarine. Try Krona on your sense of taste.
Hey, hey, hey! Good looking. What you got cooking? How's about cooking something up with me?
Enjoy healthier eating with lean cuisine, low-fat dishes like zucchini lasagna and new Kashmiri chicken curry. Less fat, more taste.
How's about cooking something up with me?
Findus Lean Cuisine.
You give me fever, fever when you hold me tight. Fever, I'm on fire. What a
Hot
lovely
water,
way to burn.
hot radiators, and a roaring open fire. The new face of British coal. Dial 100 and ask for free phone. Real fires.
In the 1930s, when South Africans talked about race or racial problems, they did not mean black and white. They meant Afrikaners versus English speakers. So when the leader of the English-speaking party, General Smuts, and the leader of the Afrikaner National Party, General Herzog, formed a coalition to combat the depression, commentators were enthusiastic.
The occasion is one of dramatic interest to the whole of South Africa, as it celebrates the uniting of the two powerful parties into a coalition government, thereby cementing the friendship of the two peoples and ending all racial controversy.
The country's real racial controversy was ignored by most white politicians and the newsreels. The subject that most worried them was the plight of some 300,000 white people, mostly Afrikaners, who were living in poverty. More than 20% of the Afrikaner community had sunk to a level thought fit only for a native. They were called poor whites. So the bitterness of Afrikaners was given an extra twist. Not only had English speakers taken control of their country, many of their people were now beggars in a society which expected its beggars to be black.
In the 1932, with the Great Depression and drought, hundreds of rural Afrikaners, farmers and people who were less skilled and unskilled, trekked through to Port Elizabeth, where they hoped to find employment. And I had the opportunity to listen to those tales of woe, of agony, of pain, of despair on the part of many of the people. The Afrikaner politicians came out and were part and parcel of those poor whites who suffered very severely. And it was the plight of many of them and of their fathers and their mothers and their families which spurred them to move into positions of political power eventually. There's no doubt about it, that was, to my mind, one of the strongest incentives towards the political action of the Afrikaner people.
One solution to the poor white problem was to stop poor blacks climbing the economic ladder. By 1929, more than 100,000 Africans had joined the Industrial and Commercial Workers' Union, which aimed to get their land back. Such a mass movement was a challenge to white domination. The new Prime Minister Herzog set out to put a stop to it. He got Parliament to abolish the vote that Britain had allowed a few blacks in the 19th century. And he doubled the 90 days Africans had to work for white farmers if they wanted to live outside reserves. They now had to do 180 days' work to qualify. Africans organized delegations to protest. Edwin Mfutsanyana was one who went to argue with Prime Minister Herzog.
This is what he said, and why I say he was honest. He said when he walked in Europe, he felt free. But every time he came back to South Africa, he was always worried because one day we shall overwhelm them.
Many Afrikaners thought Herzog was not doing enough. They wanted not just to keep the Africans under their thumb, but to beat the English speakers as well. In 1934, under the leadership of a Calvinist cleric, Daniel Malan, a group of these extremists broke away from Herzog's party. They called themselves purified nationalists. Behind them lay a secret society, the Broederbond, which had long been sworn to Afrikaner supremacy.
The basic motive was clear, and that is that the Broederbond would have to ensure that the Afrikaners' position would be definitely ensured in every sphere of life, both the political and the economic and the social and the educational and the cultural and the religious. And that is why the Broederbond included every sphere of life of the Afrikaner people and saw to it that every sphere of life was in some way being monitored, directed, and protected. And that remained the pattern of the Broederbond development throughout all these years.
Just about 100 years ago, teams of grunting oxen heaved wagons over bare rocks and scrub, as thousands of Boer farmers, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, left Cape Colony to open up the interior. They called themselves the Voortrekkers.
In 1938, the Broederbond and Milan's Purified Party organized young Afrikaners to reenact the Great Trek. This appeal to their national memory caught the imagination of the Afrikaner community, especially the young. Milan told them that they were God's chosen race and that their survival was sacred.
Some people, it really meant something religious. Many parties were wedded at the festivities. Children were being baptized. I saw in Johannesburg blind people touching and feeling with their fingers on the whole of the wagon and everything connected with it.
English-speaking South Africans were all feeling rather confident. They had a united party government, which almost all of them supported. Things were going well economically, and I think they didn't really know what this was about. It was a sort of an Afrikaner game being played over there. I don't think it bothered them at the time.
It was a massive movement of an emotional outburst on the part of the Afrikaner people. And later on, I began to realize that that was part, of the long pent-up frustration, sense of inferiority, of isolation, of loneliness, of rejection of the Afrikaner people, which all of a sudden had been given a tremendous boost by the Ossewa Trek.
The Ossewa Trek, or Ox Wagon Trek, won over thousands of Afrikaners to Milan's Purified National Party. But Herzog and Smuts underestimated the appeal of this fervor.
Smuts was, after all, an intellectual of international standing, and he thought of himself as a citizen of the world, if not the universe. And he really couldn't interest himself, and he couldn't feel this intense local Afrikaner nationalism which you had here.
Afrikaner nationalism was further whipped up by the outbreak of World War II. Prime Minister Herzog remained at heart a Boer general. He refused to take South Africa into a British war. Smuts won a narrow vote in Parliament to support Britain and took over as Prime Minister. Afrikaners were a majority in the electorate. Some backed Smuts, but many hoped for a German victory.
The general feeling was, and I participated in that the Germans might win the war, and that, with their help, we might get back to an independent South African Republic. I would say that the real reason for this was in the old saying that your enemy's enemy is your friend. It was always said that Germany is never a threat to South Africa. We had lost our independence as Afrikaners through the British, and they are still, in a certain sense, reigning us.
For the Great Trek celebration a year before the war, the Broederbond organized the Ossewa Brandwacht, or Ox Wagon Guard. It soon became a breeding ground for fascists, a training camp for arsonists, saboteurs, and anti-government agents. It also attacked Jews and blacks.
Eerste opdracht is, sê ons met die Bantu wil opblaas vir daai korantjie wat echt ons so sleg maak. Sê ek nee, ek wil nie gaan nie. Ek het 'n verskoning gemaak, dink ek. Sê ek voel nie lekker of iets, ek kan nie meer onthou nie. Dit is maar net 'n organisasie om die Afrikaners mooi by mekaar te bring. Maar die idee was om later die regering omver te gooi. Jy verstaan? Dit was die idee. Om later as Hitler kom, jy sien. Want ons het gewag dat Hitler moet kom. Die Ossewaans. Ons het gemeen, Hitler sal kom.
While the Ossewa Brandwacht, or OB, resorted to sabotage, many blacks supported the war effort. The speeches of Prime Minister Smuts made them believe the war could bring them freedom.
of modern history. This war is a new crusade, a new fight to the death for man's rights and liberties.
It was understood that the fight against Hitler's Nazism was a fight for freedom of peoples, see. The American President Roosevelt, Churchill, they met in the Atlantic and drew up a charter to unite all the peoples of the world in their nationalities and call upon them, you see. These ideas of freedom spread throughout these countries, you see. And in South Africa, you see, they accelerated the movement of consciousness amongst the people, you see.
Again?
Smuts spoke of freedom and democracy abroad, but he told his white electorate at home, of course, everybody in this country is agreed that European and African should live apart, and his government conducted the war accordingly. Black South Africans and their colored comrades who joined up were not allowed to carry firearms. They drove vehicles, and some guarded aircraft with spears. 120,000 African and colored troops were sent to risk their lives for freedom, but they were technically non-combatant. Servicemen who were not white were not supposed to fight.
You can't say that we weren't fighters, because when the enemies did come along, they jumped in the ACACs, those who were in the infantry, they're up there and so forth, they were shooting, they did everything. And we were fighters, but in actual fact, to the country, we were non-combatant. There was a time in El Alamein, when the battle was rather very strife and very strong at that time. And all the chaps were on positions, and there we were standing at our trucks and with no guns. And so the one fellow said, "Officer, can't we also have a gun?" So he said, "Yes, you can have a gun, but providing you don't shoot any of the white people, and the white people would have been there with the enemy." That was very surprising to us, and we got it and we shot just from cream because they were all enemy. Afterwards, he just said, "I hope none of you shot any white people." Oh, how do you fight the war? How do you fight the war?
The war opened a door for blacks. The need for weapons and military equipment accelerated the development of manufacturing industry. It brought more Africans than ever into urban areas.
Thousands of Africans had to be allowed to move into those jobs that had originally been done by whites who had moved up north to fight Hitler's war. And it was that industrialization, among others, that led to an upsurge in the movement for a just society.
The changing face of wartime South Africa gave new impetus to black opposition. The old leadership of the ANC, teachers, lawyers and clergymen, were under pressure from a new group, the ANC Youth League. Young men like Nelson Mandela, seen here in one of Johannesburg's segregated townships, were impatient with the organization's 30 years of defeat. The dense concentration of people in the shanty towns, where thousands of the new black industrial workers had to make their homes, opened the way for an effective mass movement. Black miners began to form a trade union. Their hopes had been raised because color bar legislation on the mines had been relaxed during the war to allow blacks to do the jobs of whites absent fighting. But when the white soldiers returned, they wanted their old jobs back. This meant black miners were demoted.
I was surprised because I had never been told that
the job I had been doing, I had done anything wrong to it. What I expected was that something would be done with me to show that I had proved to be a faithful servant during the time of difficulties. But this wasn't done. Instead, I was demoted and placed on my job without any increment. I felt that now, if people should suffer even when they had done their best under conditions that were trying, that because I'm black, I must be neglected. That is why I joined the 1946 strike.
Low wages, dangerous working conditions and poor rations for African miners had led to a series of strikes and riots after the war. Cash wages had actually fallen by a quarter over 50 years. In 1946, a mass meeting in Johannesburg decided on a strike. Sifune Mali was their slogan, Zulu for "We want more money."
As we walked down along this road, we were chanting our songs, Sifune Mali, Sifune Mali. And we hadn't been far through in that avenue where we were working when we saw lorries loaded with soldiers. And then they started charging us, and then they started hitting us, shamboking us. And then we had to charge the fence that were along the road, on the sides of the road, and we had to charge it and fell it off and then run away. Some of us never got back to their minds. What I felt that was we were being done down because we were black and so forth. I felt I wasn't having a fair treatment with Europeans.
Most white trade unions were strongly opposed to the black cause. Class divisions were race divisions.
We could not reasonably expect the white workers to side with us at a time when the horizontal caliber gave them a privileged way of life, you see, in which they had better and higher standards of living. And they would have a vested interest in such a system. Naturally, as human beings, you see, we can't expect the impossible and miracle in human life, can we? Yes. But our position was not that. We were against the white men because of the white skin. Not at all. We regard the whites, colored and Indians as human beings like ourselves. The only thing, you see, we wanted to unite against white domination. To overthrow white domination, destroy it, and open the way for a democratic society here in which every human being will be recognized as a human being and have full rights as such a human being, you see. In which the people would work together to build up a new South Africa, you see.
We, the peoples of the United Nations. Momentous opening words of the Great Charter for World Peace.
World leaders were now saying they wanted political rights for all peoples. Smuts played a key role in the drafting of the United Nations Constitution, designed to protect the principle of non-racist and universal human rights. But that made no difference to his policies at home. Segregation was South Africa's tradition. Smuts had nothing to offer the blacks whose expectations he had raised.
Well, his attitude was that there was no complete solution, no once and for all solution to this problem. He felt that the only thing you could do was to extend rights and privileges to the natives in proportion to their capacity, their ability to bear responsibility.
Smuts' approach was not enough for most Afrikaners. Just as they were beginning to struggle free from poverty and the oppression of British rule, they faced a double threat from industrial development. Their farmers were losing black labor to the cities, and in those cities, Afrikaner workers faced black competition for jobs.
We were concerned that with the movement of blacks into the urban areas, resulting from the economic integration. What would result from that would be political integration and consequently a threat, you know, to the self-determination of the whites and particularly of the Afrikaner. We saw that if we were going to find a larger and larger number of blacks permanently settled in the white areas, that their legitimate aspirations for political power could be understandable and could not be withstood.
The economy's demand for more African workers threatened to undermine the policy of segregation, and so might have challenged white supremacy. Afrikaners wanted to turn the clock back, and in the election of 1948, their national party came up with a slogan: Apartheid.
It was clear that the National Party under Dr. Malone was not making very much progress, and so they had to, as all parties do, had to look for a cause. And that is how the Apartheid Manifesto came into being. But it would be a mistake to think that the National Party, that's my own point of view, came into power on the basis of apartheid, because at that stage, what became known as apartheid, and was a very strong slogan, an easy slogan rather, was not much different from what was already known and existed under the name of segregation.
The election was to be fought largely on one issue: the future of black-white relations. The United Party under Smuts accused the nationalists of being fascist, but the nationalists said that Smuts was soft on blacks.
There was no particular plan which the nationalists could attack, but it was precisely its accusation against the United Party that was too laissez-faire about the whole situation, that they came up with what was considered to be a more ordered form of organizing race relations, and that is what apartheid eventually became.
They exploited that fear that we were going to plow them under in a sea of blacks. And of course the whole idea of calling the black people an enemy, a menace, die swart gevaar, the black peril, was a very, very unwise step. It gained them the election, but it really was sowing the dragon's teeth.
By the time Malan and his National Party came to power in 1948, blacks had long complained of the hardships imposed by segregation. Many of them thought that his policy of apartheid was just a change of name. They were to be proved cruelly mistaken.
Speaker? This movie's in stereo, buddy.
Stereo?
Should have gone to Radio Rentals.
I only bought the video last year.
If you'd rented, you could have changed it for the latest stereo video. Okay, guys, let's make it mono.
Radio Rentals. Videos you'll be glued to, not stuck with.
Extra
extrovert, cheerful, determined, caring. In this week's TV Times, the people who knew Fergie before she married Prince Andrew reveal her secret strengths as she faces her first television interview. Who's in, who's out, and who's next for the chop in the new Spitting Image series. We also tell you what's next for Dishy Damon as he quits Brookside. And we look at life's ups and downs for Britain's best-loved barmaid. For all this and details of programmes on ITV and Channel 4, get this week's big issue of TV Times.
Investigative, sometimes opinionated, always original. Every week from Friday, Channel 4's new topical documentary series Dispatches will select a report from the widest range of journalists within the independent television sector. Each dispatch will be topical and will concentrate on new and revealing stories both from home and abroad. Dispatches starts this Friday on Channel 4. Back to tonight on 4, and now A New Order, the second part of the series tracing apartheid in South Africa.
In 1948, Prime Minister Smuts was asked why he lost the most decisive election in South Africa's history.
Oh, it's the post-war desire for change, you know. People don't like the old faces and the old voices and the old smiles and the old speeches. They want to change.
What defeated Smuts was apartheid. The man who took his parliamentary seat from him was Wenzel du Plessis.
For me, apartheid is not that dirty word which people say, which people claim, and which people throw at us like bits of slush and mud. Apartheid is a fact of nature. There are not two people in this world who are the same.
When the Governor-General opened the new session of South Africa's Parliament in 1948, it was to install a National Party Prime Minister, Daniel Malan. He swept the English-speaking whites from power and appointed a cabinet of all Afrikaners, whites of Dutch descent. They were the underclass of white politics, who had at last climbed on top.
We were feeling the horizon was lifting. Skies were clearing. There was promise in the air. And we were going to avail ourselves of that opportunity, which we did.
I remember the result of that election as if it were yesterday. Up to then, there had been world reaction against racism, against the atrocities of the Nazi era. And there had been promises, of a better future. But when the nationalists came to power in 1948 under the leadership of a fellow called Dr. Malan, blacks were appalled. They were very worried that what had been said at election time might in fact come to fruition.
Not one of the country's 9 million Africans took part in the election. 70% of the population, they had lived under white rule for 300 years. Africans, together with Indians and the Coloureds, had long been the victims of racial segregation. Under apartheid, segregation was to dominate every law of the land.
If we don't do that, we'll have chaos. The black man, he would overrun you. And then what do? You shoot him. That was the thing we wanted to avoid. We don't want to shoot the black man. We would rather govern him.
The triumphant Afrikaners soon dedicated their national monument. It celebrated their victories over Africans. Also their determination to escape from rule by the British. Many of them envied the wealth and power still in the hands of the English-speaking whites.
This position of
inferiority, being the underdogs in their own country, that was the real cause for the high temperature of Afrikaner nationalism. And it was this high temperature of Afrikaner nationalism, supported by the Dutch Reformed Church, etc., that united the Afrikaners and bring about the National Party victory in 1948, and the National Party is still in power after 38 years.
The National Party had won the election on their promise to stem the flow of Africans drawn into the cities in search of work. Poor whites feared competition from cheap labor. Makeshift squatter camps had mushroomed around the white suburbs of the major towns.
One must remember that we are few and they are many. And white people were afraid that if blacks, coloreds and Indians were given free access to all amenities and all residential areas, this would result in the swamping of white areas with the deterioration of standards.
Such fears lay behind the new government's race measures. In 1950, in a law reminiscent of Europe a generation earlier, all South Africans were classified according to the color of their skin. New laws banned marriage and even sex between whites and any other racial group.
It creates a hybrid race, a bastard race. I'm very sorry that we have 1.5 million colored people in this country. They are the product of sins created by black and white people alike in this country. They are a people to be pitied rather than feared, the colored people.
The 1 million coloreds lived mainly in the Cape. Many had intermarried with whites. They were the worst affected by the new laws.
Something like the Mixed Marriages Act simply had the added symbolical and emotional significance that you were being labeled outcast, that in the most intimate relationships with other people, where personal choice in the past had played the main role, you were being treated as some object that could be shifted around, as in a zoo.
Then in 1951, the government took away the coloured's right to vote, a legacy of British rule in the Cape. The vote had even been enjoyed by some blacks until it was removed in the 1930s. Now the coloured's, backed by some liberal whites, appealed to the Supreme Court in defence of their vote. The court found for them, so the government appointed new judges.
Their goal was simply to get rid of the coloureds, and if it meant that they had to pack the High Court, they had to pack the Senate, you know, in other words, render all the parliamentary institutions nugatory. If it meant that they had to do that, then they were going to do that, you know. So that on the one hand, they were going to keep on ruling with these institutions. On the other hand, they're going to make these institutions merely paper institutions that they could, you know, use as they wished.
The harshest measures fell on the Africans. In the hunt for work in the cities, many had settled in mixed communities alongside white areas. In Sophiatown, a black suburb of Johannesburg, some had long ago bought homes, freehold. A few were middle class, even affluent. Most were poor, and by 1953, thousands were subtenants or squatters living in overcrowded backyards. Here, Africans, coloureds and Indians had created a distinct culture.
Sophiatown was the soul of our people. It represented resistance against apartheid. It represented success against all odds. It was a feeling of a great community that contradicted everything that the white man says about black people. You can't have different tribes staying together because they kill each other at the drop of a feather. But Sophiatown contradicted all those myths because you had all the tribes there
living together. It was very far from being a glamorous place. In fact, it was a major slum. Conditions there were bad. There was tremendous overcrowding. The quality of the housing was deplorable in the majority of cases. And you had this very high population living in a very congested area with no amenities whatsoever.
Tremendous overcrowding, of course, very bad housing conditions because of the population. But behind all this, the uniqueness of Sophiatown was that it was one of the only two freehold African townships in Johannesburg, one of the two places where Africans could own their own homes.
Under apartheid, there was no place in the towns for African homeowners. In 1953, the government ordered the 60,000 residents of Sophiatown to move out. It introduced new housing laws, requiring each race group to live in separate areas. The Africans furthest from city centres. Residents of Sophiatown protested.
Every political meeting, whether it was the Odeon Cinema or Freedom Square, as it was called, open-air meetings, we always were able to bring out a vast number of people. I remember one meeting in the Odeon Cinema, the only cinema in Sophiatown, quite a posh one too. This was packed to the doors, and Nelson Mandela and I were the chief speakers.
For Mandela and his organization, the African National Congress, the defense of Sophiatown became vital in their campaign of opposition to apartheid. Recently, thousands of ANC supporters had staged a nationwide campaign of defiance of apartheid's laws. The government replied with new penalties and put many campaign leaders on trial. In Sophiatown, the ANC needed a victory, but non-violent protest was no match for the government.
I think that people recognized that they hadn't a hope. What could they do? I mean, they had nothing. They had nothing to fight with. They were ordinary, working people who had to have a roof over their heads. There were families, there were children, there were old people. They had no organized resistance in the sense of guns and all that stuff.
In 1955, 2,000 armed police moved into Sophiatown to oversee forced removals.
I was carrying my baby. I was in the bedroom. There was confusion. And the black man said, Sisi, Sheshisa, sister, be quick. Sifigile, we have come. I said, oh my valuable things. How are they getting on the lorry? My husband was so quiet that I thought he was going to drop dead. Then the other black men came in to carry the cupboards, the stove, the what. You know, it was black in my eyes. I was standing in the bedroom just quiet. I did not know whether I was coming or going. So we just moved down the steps and we stood outside there. We looked at others taking out our things on the lorry and then others breaking. It was just breaking and taking away.
Sophiatown set the pattern for the policy of forced removals. Some were moved to a new estate in what was to become Soweto. Homeowners lost their freehold rights and became council tenants. Many were just dumped on open ground. On the rubble of Sophiatown, an all-white suburb was built. The government named it Triumph. The driving force behind the removals was the new Minister for Native Affairs, Hendrik Verwoerd. To the outside world, he presented apartheid benevolently.
If gradual separation develops and each gets his full opportunities in the group of his own people, then he can go forward with the knowledge that he can end anywhere. Whereas if you try and keep the people together, it will mean nothing else than a continual clash owing to continual competition.
Verwoerd did not distinguish only between white and black. It was white, non-white in his whole thinking. In other words, basically racism. Now, if you look at everything that he applied, for example, the fact that all lifts in public buildings in Africa were segregated. One lift for whites, one for non-whites. All the public counters in the post office, everything, segregated. All the entrances to public buildings, whites, non-whites. The benches in the public parks, marked, whites, non-whites. Taxis, whites, non-whites. A non-white taxi was not even allowed to convey the luggage of a white person. I had a written instruction from him that under no circumstances was I to shake hands with a black man when he came to see me in my office, and that in correspondence I was not to use the term dear sir. We had to use the term muna, which is an African word meaning man, literally, man or gentleman in a more euphemistic sense. So there was no familiarity, no booty business, as we say in Afrikaans.
Verwoerd insisted that Africans, natives to most whites, must now be called Bantu. He was determined to reimpose tribal divisions on them. He devised a new education system, Bantu education. It would replace the English liberal teaching of church mission schools.
Yes? The girl is washing. The girl is washing. What is this? It is a piece of soap. Altogether, what is this? It is a piece of soap.
Verwoerd delivered a stinging rebuke to black aspirations. There is no place for the Bantu above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics?
He spelled it out so very clearly in his speech to the Senate about the black man's place in society, how Bantu education was intended not only to re-tribalize him, but to make him aware forever and ever of his inferior position in society, about the pastures, the green pastures where white graze. He must know he would never be allowed to graze in those areas, that education would prepare him for his inferior status in society. Translated into inferior facilities in terms of classrooms, teacher training, qualifications, the whole panoply of the system produced an inferiorly educated child.
I wrote a pamphlet at the time which I called Education for Servitude, and that was exactly what it was. And Verwoerd was totally consistent about this at every level. I mean, I could tell you many instances of my struggle with Verwoerd on this thing, but it was totally clear. He was logical, and he wanted it to be the instrument which would ensure for good the basic philosophy of apartheid.
The Anglican Church in Johannesburg refused to teach Bantu education in its schools. Father Huddleston's school closed down. As the new system was imposed throughout the country, thousands of children and many teachers boycotted classes in protest. The ANC raised money to set up some alternative schools, but all resistance collapsed when Verwoerd issued an ultimatum.
He gave a D-Day for the teachers, for the parents to get their children to school, and the teacher to get to class. And said on a special date, if the teacher is not in class and the child is not in school, the child would never gain entrance in school again in the countries of Africa. And the teacher would never teach again under South Africa anymore. So parents said, well, Half a loaf is better than nothing. Let the children go.
From now on, African children were split up by tribal language into separate primary schools. Verwoerd imposed the same ideas on new housing schemes for Africans. In Soweto, whole areas were zoned along tribal lines.
I think he felt that if the people were divided up ethnically on a tribal basis, it would not be so easy for them to combine and present a united front against the authorities. In other words, this is an application of the age-old principle, divide and rule.
But Africans were being united by the tightening of the pass laws, long used to keep unwanted men out of the towns. Now men queued in state pass offices for the temporary right to stay. Police arrested more than 1,000 pass offenders every day.
Dr. Verwoerd said the black man was analogous to the ox on the farmer's field, and as long as he was there to serve the purpose of the farmer, well and good. But when that need had been passed, then he had to go.
The pass book was the symbol par excellence of your slave status in this country. Without it, you couldn't work, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't do a damn thing, you couldn't acquire accommodation. It became the kind of symbol that unified black people throughout the country in their determined fight to end apartheid and all that it stood for.
With the past laws tightened up by the government, it was terrible for the Africans. It was the main thing that got us into jails, and it recorded everything that the government had against you.
You needed permission to visit another town, and you couldn't sit there for more than 72 hours without the legal permit to be there. This is what we resented, because it dehumanized us as human beings. But even worse, it continued to remind us that we are black.
The ANC repeatedly protested against the pass laws. Nelson Mandela set up the first black law firm. They did all they could to frustrate the authorities.
They used to appear in court on behalf of offenders, petty offenders of the pass laws, and they were always trying to get around the regulations. It was not only pass laws, but it was the location regulations in the townships. And he was a confounded nuisance as far as I was concerned.
He practiced law at the time when he was known as a Kefa lawyer. And every time he walked into court, the magistrates were absolutely hostile. And he enjoyed seeing this hostility in them and flooring them.
In 1955, the government announced it was extending the pass laws to women. Drought and famine in the countryside were driving increasing numbers of women off the land in search of work. The government wanted them as tightly controlled as the men. ANC women united with Indians and white radicals. In 1956, they called a mass protest.
It was a wonderful sight, striding out, so determined. We presented our protest at the Prime Minister's office. It was taken by 8 leaders, literally staggering, and these enormous piles of Ronioed letters. Each one had the name and address of the woman who had sent it. The door was opened by a very frightened-looking secretary. We said, we want to see the Prime Minister. And he said, the Prime Minister is not here. And we dumped those protests all over the office. And then we withdrew, and we went back to the 20,000 women who were all sitting in the amphitheater waiting very patiently. Lillian couldn't make a speech, that was our leader. She just said the Prime Minister was not there. He has run away from the women. And you could literally feel the anger of the women that we have been treated like this.
In the late 1950s, the women grew more militant. In several areas, they burnt the new passes in front of government offices. The authorities were taken by surprise at the vigor of the women's protests. These demonstrations set the stage for South Africa's biggest political show trial.
There's only one word for it: Guinness.
Should the worst happen, you'll be glad Irish Road Motors invested heavily in our award-winning body shop. We use genuine Ford parts from our well-stocked parts department. And because we operate 2 shifts, working day and night, we'll put you back on the road quickly, expertly, economically, and in half the time it would normally take. Irish Road Motors, the hub of the North. Craigavon, and now also in Belfast.
Making a real impression has never been easier, because there's one name behind some of the most exciting home fashion ideas you've ever seen. A name that can give you a totally coordinated look in home furnishings, wall coverings, ceramics, and so much more.
Very nice.
Why, thank you. You probably know the name already. Men Only, from Calero, of course.
And we've just finished this room.
To achieve the desired effect,
Oh, excuse me.
you'll need a little help from one of the most exciting names in home fashion. A name that offers you a totally coordinated look in wall coverings, home furnishings, ceramics, and so much more. And the name? Covent Garden, from Calero, of course.
Every time you buy a tin of Campbell's soup, what you're actually buying is this, because Campbell's soup is condensed. And so it leaves you this much room to add recipe ideas of your own, like chicken stock in our cream of mushroom. Campbell's, the only soups that leave you this much room for your own ideas.
The new Creda Concept Solar Plus, a ceramic hob featuring 2 halogen heating areas, low-profile controls with advanced display, 2 versatile ovens, conventional and circular fan, and the Solar Plus grill, which heats up faster than any other grill. To show you how fast, here's something I prepared earlier.
Incredible. No, Creda.
By 1955, despite growing resistance to apartheid, the government had skillfully silenced many of its leading opponents. But the African National Congress and its white and Indian allies hit back. They called a national convention, which was to lead to a public humiliation for the state.
Thousands turned up from all over South Africa in spite of police attempts to stop them arriving. Special trains were organized, but they were prevented from getting there. But nevertheless, thousands and thousands came. It looked just like Derby Day. It was a marvelous weekend.
Africans, coloureds and Indians met to spell out their grievances and the reforms they wanted to see. They adopted a freedom charter. White minority rule, it declared, had robbed the majority of the land. They demanded that all South Africans be given equal rights.
It was the biggest political gathering that I had attended up to that time, and I don't think that any gathering of that size, political, had been held in the history of South Africa. And what was striking was that it involved people of all the languages of South Africa, all the tribes, all the races.
At the end of the two-day conference, the police searched every delegate and confiscated all their documents. They wanted evidence against Congress leaders for the trial that they believed would finally terminate their activities.
The adoption of the Freedom Charter was absolute anathema. Who are these people to prescribe what sort of state we are going to have in the future? And they were convinced that they would get a conviction of treason of anyone or of everyone who had anything to do with the Congress of the People or the adoption of the Freedom Charter.
In December 1956, the police arrested 156 Congress leaders. They were charged with treason. The opening of the trial was mobbed by supporters of the accused.
All we could hear was the 100,000 voices singing in unison, demonstrating their solidarity with us. Of course, we were separated from our white colleagues who were put in a different section altogether. So it was a coming together of people from throughout the country to you could say, a mass conference at the Johannesburg fort.
I was quite satisfied that I had not committed any act of treason, and no person whom I knew and with whom I had been doing anything. In fact, the policy had always been opposition by non-violent means. And the slogan of non-violence was accepted by all of us, and none of us thought of anything except civil disobedience if it came to the crime.
For 5 years, the trial tied down ANC leaders like Mandela. For the government, it ended in humiliation. They failed to get a single conviction against any of the 156 defendants.
I think this treason trial was the last major attempt to deal with the political opposition by the due process of law.
In 1958, ANC leaders fell out. Some defended the ANC's alliance with white radicals.
Well, I think the policy of the Congress movement as a whole was multiracialism, and that meant equal recognition of all racial groups, and the ANC implemented that in its political practice. So there is a foundation in the policy, and by the way, the Freedom Charter says that South Africa should belong to all, irrespective of color, and that all racial groups should be equal.
A rival group maintained that Africans must have no white allies. They alone must recover all their land and run it.
The Freedom Charter really meant those who own about 87% of our land will retain ownership of that, you see? And only perhaps out of the kindness of their heart concede 1 acre there and another there to us. Now we couldn't go for that sort of thing.
This minority argued that multiracialism would hinder their recovery of the land. Inspired by the independence movements of Black Africa, they preached Africa for the Africans. Their leader, Robert Sobukwe, told them, In the new Africa, there will be no special privileges for any class of people. Here in Africa, we are the majority. We should rule.
You know, the appeal he made to me was an appeal that for the first time I saw myself as a human being with human dignity. But whose human dignity before his speech was not something that I was conscious of, you see. He aroused a sense of, revolt in my mind.
In 1959, Sobukwe and others quit the ANC to form the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress. At the same time, the opposition to apartheid laws grew. A rash of protests broke out all over South Africa. Whole townships boycotted public transport and walked to work rather than pay increased bus fares. Then in Cato Manor, a sprawling slum outside Durban, poverty and police harassment produced an explosion of anger. Women protested when police repeatedly raided their home-brewed beer stores. The men were spending their money in beer halls run by the city council. The profits were used to cover the cost of administering the pass laws.
Women were complaining that men were coming home on Fridays empty-handed, having drank up all the money at those beer halls. And since they were drinking every day and borrowing money from people here and there, and then on Friday, on payday, they pay out the monies they borrowed. They felt that these beer halls must go. And they opened the valves. Beer was rolling out into the street, and women climbed and went into the tanks, showing that this beer is not fit for human consumption, and women are bathing in this beer.
When the police arrived to break up the demonstration, the protest turned into a riot. Government offices and buses in Cato Manor were destroyed. By the end of the year, violent protest at government controls had spread across the whole of Natal province. The violence worried the ANC.
Well, the ANC, committed as it was to peaceful and non-violent methods of struggle, issued over 100,000 leaflets appealing to the people to actually stop the violence and use peaceful methods of struggle.
While the ANC tried to calm the women in Natal, the newly formed PAC decided that the time was ripe for a defiance campaign of its own. Its target, the hated pass laws. PAC leaders believed that they could galvanize Africans into a popular uprising. Passes on a special day, they said, were to be left at home.
It was by way of creating chaos, a chaotic situation whereby the authorities would not be able to handle the effects of the campaign. They could not imprison the whole population, for instance, if it snowballed to that extent. They did not have room even if they wanted to, you see, and so on. And in any case, it was aimed at divesting the African people of fear of imprisonment.
The 21st of March 1960 was the PAC's chosen day. The response to their call was patchy. But at Sharpeville, a new township south of Johannesburg, Anger at recent removals brought a crowd of 5,000 to watch the protest.
They were ready because they hated this bus system. They thought there was going to be a relief. I think during those days when you talk of getting rid of a bus, you would get cooperation because they knew the sufferings of the buses. So they responded, most of them.
The police in Sharpeville refused to arrest PAC members. After 3 hours, the crowd pressed forward. The police panicked and fired.
As I was standing on the bike, the next thing I found myself lying down. I didn't realize at the moment that I was shot. The bullet came here, this flesh was down, came up this way. There were 15 stitches here.
250 were shot. 69 lay dead, among them 8 women and 10 children.
I saw others whose flesh was also hanging. We walked slowly towards the main street. Ambulances were bringing many people, and we saw some were crying. I even heard one saying, "Oh, so-and-so is dead." Then I realized this was terrible.
As Africans burnt their passes in nationwide protests, the government was forced temporarily to suspend all pass arrests. Strikes and walkouts forced whites to do jobs normally done by blacks. Worldwide criticism was focused on South Africa. Capital flowed out of the country. Verwoerd, who had recently become Prime Minister, tried to calm the fears of both whites and foreign investors.
We shall not be killed. We shall become nobody's corpse. We shall fight for our existence, and we shall survive.
Cape Town is tense. So is the whole Union of South Africa. Where it is calm outwardly, the news is all of race hatred. Everyone feels that the next day, even the next hour, may see parliamentary government swept aside.
9 days after Sharpeville, for the first time in South Africa's history, black anger struck close to the white parliament itself. "30,000 Africans marched into Cape Town to demand the release of PAC leaders. The march was led by a 19-year-old student, Philip Hosanna.
Hosanna came to address us. He told us that we should be non-violent as we have promised before, and that we should march peacefully down to Parliament. When we arrived in Parliament, we find that the Parliament was blocked by the soldiers. So we turned back and we went now to Caledon Square to demand the release of our leaders.
The police chief confronted the crowd outside the police station. Hosanna demanded to see the Minister of Justice.
I said to Hosanna, I said, this is not the way you ask for an interview with the minister. I suggest that you take the whole crowd back to their residences and depute 3 or at the most 4 of your men to come back at 5 o'clock. I'll convey your message to the minister. Then I'll tell you what the minister says and what his attitude is.
Unknown to Hosanna, the minister had already spoken to the police chief and ordered him to use force to disperse the crowd.
If I were compelled to use force, I would have thought that Cape Town would have gone up in flames. It would have been a terrible, terrible business. to use force, because I know the black man, I know his language, and I know his culture. And I know when he sees blood, he goes virtually mad.
Hosanna took the police chief's word that he would persuade the minister to meet a delegation. The police chief gave him a loud hailer to repeat the undertaking. The gamble worked. With a police escort at their head, the demonstrators left Cape Town and marched back to the locations where they lived.
We didn't know that a government man could fail to keep the promise.
Why didn't the meeting take place?
That I don't know. Minister didn't agree.
Were you disappointed?
I was obviously disappointed, yes. I was very disappointed. Because my word of honor had failed.
When Hosanna returned, expecting to meet the minister, he was arrested and imprisoned. The government imposed a nationwide state of emergency. The army scoured the townships. Police arrested thousands of political activists and leaders. Within a week, the government outlawed both the ANC and the PAC. As Sharpeville residents buried their dead, many began to question the black nationalist movement's 50-year commitment to non-violence.
The whole movement re-examined our past, which was a past of non-violence and pacifism. It had become clear by the end of the 50s that the potential for bringing about change through the old methods had exhausted itself. The people were no longer really prepared to continue responding to calls which led to brutal responses from the enemy without retaliation by the people.
Sharpeville launched a new phase in the relations between the government and its opponents. White fears of an African backlash grew. Housewives spent hours on weapons training. Defiantly, Verwoerd declared South Africa a republic and ended his country's Commonwealth links with Britain.
We are at the beginning of a new era, the era of the Republic of South Africa. The onslaughts which may be made against us will not be made against our form of government. If ever it does come, it will be an onslaught on the existence of our nation and our way of life as we know it. And that we must protect with all that is in our power.
The creation of a republic, cutting the link with Britain, shocked black leaders. They called for a strike. Despite army action in the townships, the stay-at-home was South Africa's biggest protest yet. Now in hiding, ANC leader Nelson Mandela spoke to journalists.
There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay-at-home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country, notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned.
Mandela went abroad in 1961 because, apart from gangsters, the blacks had never used a weapon in their life. The only way in which we could pursue this side of the struggle was to find a way of getting material and training militants. Mandela went out to see the newly independent states for the purpose of getting their assistance and the possibility of supplying the kind of weaponry which was needed.
Now, you would have thought having the opportunity to leave the country, he'll stay out. No, he didn't. He came back. And of course, the whole police force in South Africa was looking for him for months. And that's when he earned the name of the Scarlet Pimpernel. And he seemed to absolutely enjoy his escapades.
On December the 16th, 1961, explosions shook South Africa. What Mandela had been doing was organizing Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. With help from the Communist Party, its attacks were carefully designed to avoid taking life. His fellow commander of this sabotage group was Joe Slovo.
I don't think we actually had the illusion that by the kind of actions in which we were engaged, we would bring them immediately to the negotiating table. I think it was a sort of shot for the future in the hope that they would see sense, and they didn't.
At the same time, those PAC leaders still at large were more responsive to demands for a general rising. The townships in the Cape hid an arsenal of homemade weapons.
The people would come to us carrying their pangas, some of them carrying revolvers. They would demand to us that, look, here are weapons, because our argument was that you cannot challenge an armed man unless you yourself are armed.
They would even point to a distant suburb, a distant suburb of Port Elizabeth, where white people, rich white people live. We want to go there and cut their throats.
Poco, an offshoot of the PAC, launched a series of mob attacks. In one of them, 5 whites were brutally murdered. The government responded with sweeping new security laws. A new sabotage act was designed to muzzle radical opposition. Press censorship, house arrest, and bannings silenced all but a few. When white liberals protested, government supporters attacked their meetings. In 1963, long detention without trial was introduced. Suspects began to be locked away without any right of appeal to the courts.
By its very terms, the 90-day or the 180-day or the indefinite detention laws compelled a person who was detained and was later accused of a crime to speak, and that he was told that he would not be released from solitary confinement, or as the police call it, social isolation, until such time as he made a statement to the satisfaction of the Commissioner of Police, which in practice meant to his interrogator.
Detention without trial, isolation in police cells, physical and psychological torture. Practices which, in my experience, in the 50s and the 40s, were never engaged in by the security services. This was something new, and it became very difficult for a person who was dealt with in this way to resist collapsing under this kind of barrage of torture.
By 1963, Poco had effectively been crushed, and the police arrested the commanders of the ANC sabotage campaign. The 10 accused admitted sabotage and faced the death penalty. Mandela was their main spokesman.
He and his courtiers decided that they would nevertheless not pull any punches, that they would say what they had to say in a loud and clear voice. And what it really amounted to was, you made us do it. We had no alternative.
The main black political movements were now crushed. Mandela and all but one of the accused were found guilty of treason. Massive international campaigns pleaded for clemency. The court withheld the death sentence. ANC leaders who had not been imprisoned went into exile to try to maintain their struggle from abroad. Verwoerd had fulfilled the Afrikaner dream. Many whites had doubted the wisdom of apartheid when the government came to power in 1948. Now they looked forward to a future where everyone in South Africa would continue to know his place